This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
A little self-care can go a long way, especially amidst the hustle and bustle of the holidays. That's where Vegamore comes in. Trusted by millions, Vegamore is all about giving your hair the love and care it deserves. With their vegan and cruelty-free formulas, you can nourish and revitalize your strands while indulging in some much-needed pampering. Because let's face it, who couldn't use a bit more me time this time of year? Go to vegamore.com/ACAST, code ACAST. That's vegamor.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody and welcome to the Writers on Film podcast. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Lynne Sachs, an experimental filmmaker based in New York. Her films are currently showing on the Criterion Channel, and her latest, one of her latest feature films, a film about a father who is a wonderful documentary about a portrait of her own father. Well, as a filmmaker, Lynne is also a poet, and her latest collection, Year by Year Poems, is published by Tender Button Press. It's a brilliant idea, brilliant concept, and some beautiful poetry in there. Comes highly recommended. Remember, if you like the episode, please subscribe and spread the word if you haven't already. If you wish to, you can follow me on Twitter. A Twitter handle is at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation. Yeah, so I really enjoyed it. What a brilliant concept, the year by year. What a wonderful idea.
I really appreciate your saying that. And I have since writing that book or completing that book, which was in the end of 2019, I've actually taught a few different film poetry workshops. And I find that using that as a construct by which I say to people, think about a year in your life and write, I say, try to write 5 things that might have happened in that year, but not necessarily the most historically important events, but things that happened in your life, and then build on that. And people feel such a relief because it takes them right back to their own lives, but from sort of a different doorway into that experience. So. Yeah,
I that's exactly that. That's what I loved about the originality of the concept, is that it's so kind of literally grounded. There's a sort of discipline to it. I started my writing, I think my first published stuff was poetry when I was back in Liverpool, when I was a student in Liverpool. And we used to run a performance poetry group called the Kitchen Club.
Oh, I love that name.
Yeah, well, we thought of it in a kitchen. So, it was...
Well, actually, the program that has hosted me a few times for this film poetry workshop is coming out of a foundation created by John Ashbery, the American poet. But the series is called Text Kitchen.
Text Kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
The analogy works, doesn't it, though? Because you're putting in all these ingredients and you're putting them through processes of, acid, heat, and what have you. And it doesn't always work.
And then you test it on your friends and family and you see what they think.
And they're polite. Usually they're polite. What do you feel is the connection between poetry and filmmaking? Because I feel when I was reading your anthology, and I've seen your films, it's so tempting to draw these analogies and draw these lines between the two things. Do you feel they're distinct, or do you feel there's a real connection there?
Well, it's interesting that you tell me a little bit of your story, which was that you started in a poetry group. And I was also writing poetry before I thought I wanted to be involved in film. And I have found it to be very exhilarating and, let's say, full of detours that are super helpful to kind of embrace both film and poetry. Because if you love poetry, then you aren't obligated to, for example, look at your films and think that words only find their place on the, quote, dialogue track. That the convention for feature films is you have a music track, or you have a dialogue track, and you have an effects track. But if you come out of poetry, you like the sound of words and the kind of shadings of words as much as you like the words as they are used as a form of communication. Coming from Gertrude Stein or other poets who believe in, like you were saying, the spoken word. How does the word enter you viscerally, not just cerebrally? And so that relationship to words is very liberating as you're working in film. And I would say I've been very inspired by Robert Altman's films, because I feel that he creates these layers of what you call dialogue track, so that you don't always understand them narratively, but you understand how people relate to each other, almost like both physically and rhythmically and rhetorically, all those other ways that people's bodies and minds bounce up against each other. So, but I think the convention in both documentary and narrative filmmaking is to think of words as a way to move story.
My experience of certainly reading poetry was, I always saw a close connection between poetry and cinema, not because so much of the sound of the words, but the techniques being used, the way a scene would shift, the way within the space of a phrase, there would be the equivalent of a jump cut or a dissolve.
Oh, exactly. And so I totally agree. Like a line break is in poetry is really a parallel experience to let's say an Eisensteinian shift in a cut and film that isn't strictly about cause and effect, which is more of a kind of, more of a template in a more conventional way of working. But the line break and the cut, if you see those as very comparable, is very kind of exciting.
When did you start working on films then? When did you first sort of pick up a camera? And I mean, was it you were writing poetry first?
Yeah, I was in a poetry group kind of like yours. In college, and I was also writing poetry in high school pretty actively, and I had a poetry magazine that we started at my high school, which we called Scheherazade. So, it was about that's 1,001 story, and so that was such a big part of my life. And I was the kind of person who I actually was not that interested in the movies growing up, because I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and there were not opportunities to see alternative films, and there were not opportunities to see films by women. I'd never heard of a woman director. So I just wanted to make art, and actually my major in university was was history. So I was very involved in academics and writing and also art making. And then I started to go to the movies that they offer on campus. And I saw Rainer Fassbinder's movies. And that was like an intense revolution for me to think that films could be that raw and that informal, but also very, 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 very visual, was just astonishing to me. And then I lived for a year in Paris, where you could just hop around at midday and see something like Les Enfants de Paradis, or you could see a film by Chantal Akerman or Marguerite Duras. And that was just eye-opening to me and like so exciting and seemed very parallel to writing poetry. So then I went back to college and started to get more interested in the possibility of filmmaking. And I took a course when I finished at the School of Visual Arts here. And I had a great uncle who gave me a wind-up regular 8mm camera that is the size of your hand and doesn't even use a battery. I started to shoot with that and had that. He was always really encouraging of my making images. And I was super fond of Uncle Charlie. And actually his wife, my Aunt Isabel, was a lover of poetry. So she had hundreds, maybe thousands of artist-made books. She just had this collection. And I'm not trying to say everyone in my family was into art, but she happened to have those books. And she didn't have many people in art who were interested. So I would go over and look at those books. So they were really important to me. And then I started to discover sort of what you would call experimental documentary, and saw, for example, the film, this is a little bit later, but Sans Soleil by Chris Marker. And that was really a major revelation to me, that film.
In what way was the Chris Marker film, what struck you? What affected you?
Oh my goodness. I love that he was a filmmaker, not a director. So that it came out of an art making practice and a living practice. And for him also the notion of travel, and that as you traveled, you didn't just imbibe other people's worlds, you thought about them, or you thought about how it allowed you to understand your culture better by seeing another culture. I loved the emphasis that he had on articulating his politics, and I identified with what I would call a left-wing sensibility. And that's remained really important to me to see, and that kind of comes out of my degree is in history. So, trying to see conflict, see how things resolve themselves. My films are always aware of history and what brought us to a certain place, and then how we can climb our way out. And I thought that Chris Marker did that. And he also worked alone. And I thought that was really liberating, because it wasn't appealing to me necessarily to work with a big crew. Over the years, I've worked with people on teams and I've collaborated on a lot of things, but I don't have to do that. I'm pretty self-sufficient. So
that's the sort of poet in you that, once you've had a pencil and a piece of paper, everything else seems superfluous.
Yeah.
It's funny as well when you're telling the story of, going to Paris, and because I've got these poems very fresh in my mind, I'm going, oh, that's poet. That's 19.
Yeah, there's a poem I wrote about standing in a telephone booth that really dates me. You read that one. It's from 1982, I think, where I'm, in order to call home, I have to put coins in the telephone. And then, and I'm imagining my brother, and that was a real, early 80s he was kind of, let's say, figuring out or announcing that he was gay. And, I don't know if you ever saw this, but used to be that if you wore an earring on one ear, that meant, yeah, you're gay or not gay. You know what I mean? I don't remember which ear was which, but it was like a semiotics of of your identity.
I think we're a fairly similar generation. I definitely spent a lot of time in phone booths in my youth, phoning people up, and also the idea of distance as well. You know, when you went to France, I think it's a different experience to somebody going to France today, in the sense of or any distance.
Well, also a big part of my films, the exploration in my films, has to do with translation. So, like, actually, one of the films that's going to be in the Criterion Channel is called Which Way is East? And I made that in Vietnam in 1994. My sister was living there. And, we were people who'd grown up during what Americans call the Vietnam War. And so my sense of Vietnam came through the mainstream news until I went there. And it was really about witnessing it and listening to stories. But a big part of it was also that I was an outsider and that I had to recognize that my language, being English, was not the dominant language. And I think that's a really important position for people to have, especially Americans and especially English-speaking people. And that has changed so much now because more and more people speak English, and so there's an assumption that we can carry our language. And back in those days when we were teenagers, or we had to go to places and find the tools to communicate on the terms with the people whose community or country we were visiting, and so actually in a lot of my films, like also the Washing Society, which is in the Criterion program as well, I have whole sections in Spanish and whole sections in Chinese, not very long, but some, where the listener, if the listener is English speaking, has to have that sense of alienation. And I don't always deliver subtitles, and I think subtitles are a way of bringing people back to a dominant language all the time. So I think it's important to make us feel, to listen to the texture of a language and how it's delivered, not just to its translation, and then which it becomes then a default that you just stop listening. So
yeah, translation becomes a sort of I think it was Brecht who was giving evidence in some sort of hearing, and they read out one of his poems and said, look, this is obviously a communist poem, Mr. Brecht. Did you write this? And he said, no, but I wrote a very similar one in German.
Oh, that is fantastic. That is great.
That idea that translations are always similar, but they're never the same.
Well, there's an essay that Walter Benjamin wrote called The Task of the Translator. And I even made a film called The Task of the Translator. So that was inspired by that essay. And he says exactly what you are saying, that actually the translator is offering a gift to the original, but offering something new, that they're actually, again, they're in parallel, but they are not equal. So, and you can sometimes invigorate text through its translation, but don't erase it as a journey.
I was thinking as well, when you didn't use the subtitles in the film, I was also thinking of the Claude Lanzmann documentary Shoah, where he sort of purposefully goes through an interpreter for many of his interviews, and keeps the original and the interpreter's translation in, when, of course, he could have reduced the film by a third if he cut out the interpreter and just subtitled the original testimony. But I think I don't know, there's something about putting on screen that process and saying, look, this is going through several people's heads, makes it much more powerful and much more kind of honest, really.
I totally agree. And I have to say, the Shoah series and Claude Lanzmann's work have been so important to me. I am so grateful that you brought that up. It's interesting because, at least in the United States, Shoah it was a television series, was the first introduction to our culture of mainstream recognition of the word Shoah, like the Shoah. People talked about the Holocaust, but not as much as you would think. And that film was so important. And one of the things that Shoah did, which has really influenced my work, again, going back to the film I made in Vietnam, Which Ways East, but also The Last Happy Day, which is also in the Criterion series, which has to do a film where I look at World War II through a very distant cousin of mine, is that what Claude Lanzmann chose to do is not to use images of concentration camps, because I think he thought that was too facile, and that he thought, I want to evoke what it was to be in those camps or to witness them through the words. And actually, this is kind of a cliche, but when people say an image, a photo or an image is worth 1,000 words, even though I'm an image maker, I actually think 1,000 words can be more potent because it's about interpretation and it's not so uninflected. It has that subject. Like, how do you express subjectivity? So when he didn't include the images of the concentration camps, he made his viewers go into their own archive, the internal archive of that, which I think can be more haunting. Now, if you were to make Shoah in 2021, I'm not sure that you could rely on a broad audience to know what the concentration camps look like. And so it might be different today. I actually wonder about that, because wonder about young people and how accessible those images are in our own internal archive. But I think that was a very interesting choice of his. And I think it activates, kind of in a Brechtian way, as you were talking about earlier, but it activates the audience, to the spectator, we'll say, to really participate in a much more active and less passive way.
Thinking about today and thinking about 2021, I think we need a Shoah. We need people to see Shoah much more than maybe when he originally made it. It feels like it's a film that's only increased in urgency. Absolutely. And similarly, in terms of looking back towards Vietnam in your film, there's a sense that it's interesting that you come from a background of history, because I feel we're really living in a period where history is much more important than maybe it was a little while ago. I'm not sure. Maybe every age has its catastrophe, and we're just living through our...
Well, I found it to be extremely interesting, to at least here in New York, but maybe across the world. So there are a few days or weeks that people in New York can walk through. Like, almost everyone I know who is older than 24 right now can tell you exactly what went on in their lives on September 11th, 2001. Like, walk through the day.
Yeah.
Walk you through that narrative. There aren't many other days in one's life that you could recount the whole day. But if you lived in New York that day, you probably can. And then for me, of late, would be the first week of March of 2020, when but it would be different in Italy. It would be earlier, probably. Yeah. But here, the first week of March, people can tell you sort of a micro history of, well, then March 1st, I thought this, but by March 6th, that this was happening. And it's very interesting to hear them. And it's a little bit like going through an internal home movie. And also, history works in another kind of way, because we rewrite it as people share it with us, and then we think we reappraise how we remember it. And in my own filmmaking, I am always interested in the retelling of things in a subjective way, rather than the accuracy of exactly what happened.
How do you sort of balance what you were saying earlier as well about your admiration for Chris Marker and that sort of political urgency of doing something, with sort of having a subjective point of view and having, wanting to express yourself?
There's this constant, call it a conundrum, between being an artist and being someone who wants to create change in society. Like, right, we call that an activist. And I've always been moved and as engaged as I thought I could be in political action. But I don't know if I would call myself an activist, because I think that would be misrepresenting who I am. So it's probably that I make films that I hope will cause people to ask questions and to re-examine their situations, their context. If you were in a movie, like the diegesis of your place in the world. But I don't make films that tell people what to do or what to think. So in that way, I'm not sure if my goals are they're to change thinking and hopefully to make change in the world. But I don't expect people to walk out of my films and go do a political act, but to think about, if you saw Epistolary, which is a short film, and also which is going to be in this Criterion series,
the letter to Jean Vigo.
Yeah. I was horrified by the, I'll say it, right-wing effort to not overthrow the government, because they were perfectly happy with the president, but they were overflowing the democratic system, trying to, in the United States, by breaking into the Capitol on January 6th of this year. And I wanted people to think about that and to think about, well, where does that impulse start? And also, can we look at the period of childhood in all of our lives as innocent, or does a kind of venal way of being start at that time, like in the novel Lord of the Flies, that kind of evil. So I guess that's a film, that's a very short film where I'm very pleased and fascinated and awed by the anti-authoritarian gestures in Jean Vigo's film Zero for Conduct. But I also wonder, what happens when that itself goes awry? So it's really, I don't come to an answer there. I just want people to think about it.
I think that's what's been so discombobulating for the left recently, has been the fact that a lot of iconography and those ideas of, the French Revolution, Occupy Wall Street, V for Vendetta, Guy Fawkes masks, and all this idea of, make trouble and protest and stuff like that, has been sort of co-opted by the right. And I suddenly find myself going, where are the police? That's like...
Well, actually, there was supposed to be a right-wing protest 2 days ago, Saturday, in Washington, D.C., and it's so funny because it was a flop. And one of the reasons was they said there was a sea of police officers there. And when I heard that, and I part of me is like, for the abolition of the police. But then, when there's a right-wing mandate, I'm kind of happy the police were there in their uniform. So it's confusing.
It really is.
And I made a film actually in 2001 about civil disobedience, and I'm actually an advocate of civil disobedience as long as it's nonviolent and that.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
People's lives are not ruined by it, but I made a film about a group of Catholic anti-war activists who broke into a selective service or draft office here in the US and burned draft files with napalm. So it was like a performance piece. It's called Investigation of a Flame. So, you know, I like that disruption of the rule of law when there's a cause that I believe in.
And therein lies the rub.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But the thing was, nobody was hurt.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah, I've got a horrible feeling that the squadristi of and all the neo-fascists have no such quibbles or compunction. You know. I was watching two of your films earlier today as well. I watched Maya at 24, which is your film of your daughter running around in circles. What a neat idea! Again, that in itself is where I would connect the poetry. I would just say that's the poem. You know, that's just a poem. It's a poem that is with music and with images, but it's the same way that you would read a poem and you would have that multivalency. You would have lots of different meanings coming through and lots of different ideas coming through, but at the same time, very difficult to sort of pin down. Or the minute you start to put it into words, it's like, nah, that doesn't quite capture what I'm feeling. But
thank you so much.
But that seemed to be like a preoccupation that you have as well in one of your most recent films, I think, in terms of feature length films, the film about a father who. I was interested in this idea of family. You were talking about family earlier on in terms of your auntie and uncle and how much they influenced you, and then your brother. So family seems to be extremely sort of present for you.
I'll just say that I think that your parents have an imprint on you, and you have, then it's generational, and then you have an imprint on your children, and I'm interested in how those things pass through. And some people talk about the trauma of the past, but I'm also interested in something that is maybe less easy to define, but has to do with this, like a kind of conveying of sensibility, of ways of perceiving, and how we actually just simply look at each other and then it becomes like a mirror back on ourselves. So with Maya at 24, I'm filming her at 3 different ages, and the only direction I give is let's both go in a circle and try to keep looking at me and into the lens of the camera. And at certain periods of time, like when she's 6, 16, and 24, she confronts that, or she's frustrated by that, or she's very compliant. There's different kinds of relationships that have to do with a parent telling a child what to do. And like, you could have defiance, or you could have agreement, or, you know, also I think in her eyes, as she gets older, she becomes more self-conscious. So I was interested in that in a nonverbal way. And you probably noticed in Film About a Father Who, I asked my father to walk in circles around me. And I like that there's this tether. I think that the tether between the camera lens and the face of the person being filmed is something that hasn't been explored enough, but that is revealing in a lot of different ways. Like when people in a conventional documentary say, don't look at the camera lens, look 3/4 off. That kind of compliance doesn't allow for a kind of the physicality that could happen and between the two bodies, between the person behind the lens and in front of the lens. So I don't like those kind of rules, but I've been told that it's expected, but I've always resisted that.
If you apply too much to those sort of conventions, you just end up with cliche. Surely everything looks the same. Everybody's doing the same thing.
I was shooting that film I mentioned before, Investigation of a Flame, in 2001 by myself, and a friend of mine who worked for National Geographic said, well, how are you going to be able to shoot that by yourself? Because the person you're interviewing is going to be looking right at you. And I said, well, that's fine. I want that energy. And there's a point where the camera, meaning me, looks off during a point where the person I'm interviewing was talking about something and I look out the window, as people do. And sometimes we look out the window because we're so focused that we have to let our minds, digest what we've heard. And so again, that would be considered like the breaking of a rule. You're supposed to keep the camera on a tripod, and you're supposed to have the person look off off axis a little bit. And Errol Morris plays with this too. But it's if you work only within those templates, then there's no nuance to the image.
Do you think documentary as well has this sort of, perhaps because of this small scale element to it, you only really need, one person can do it, It seems to foster perhaps more independent creativity than sort of fiction filmmaking.
At times, but not always. And I think that's happening more and more in probably the last 5 years. But about maybe 6 years ago, I went to a documentary film festival, and they had a panel on documentary as a practice, and they invited 6 or 7 directors who were there at the festival. And the first question that the facilitator asked, or not question, it was a statement that he said, well, of course, we all know that a good documentary starts with character. And then I thought, oh, that's really rotten. I disagree with him completely. Plus, that's saying we owe everything to literature and narrative and to those conceits or tropes that's why Chris Marker was so exciting to me, because it didn't start with a character. Maybe you find a character. And I think the film that I made with my father, film about a father who he becomes a character, but he's a fragmented character because of my frustrations. And that those fissures of maybe allow people to enter in a more personal way. Whereas if you just made a character-driven documentary, then you feel when you finish, oh, I know that person, but do I know myself any better? Probably not.
And and in that movie, there's a real sense of movement as well, and expansion of interest, because I think it very much starts focused on your father, and you think, oh, okay, we're going to discover who this guy is, and then by the end of it, it's really moved off to expand and include all the children. It's become, a much broader portrait.
I appreciate you're saying that, because that is exactly what happened. That it occurred to me while I was making that he. This is a little bit of a cliche, but since there are not ultimately 9 children in my family, my father's children, that it was sort of like these planets circulating around the sun, and some planets were hidden, and then other planets were always there. And I actually really tried to work with that, and I was like, this is too obvious, throw it out. But and I'll say it to you now, it really was like this cosmos, and there's this idea, there's there's a new planet, like we happen, and that kind of thing where we think everything's set. We thought the solar system was set. Oh my God, there's another one. And all of us have this way, especially as we become adults, where we start to say, oh, okay, now I understand the matrix of my existence. I am the child of these 2 people. Maybe you knew them, maybe you didn't. And then I exist this way. Now I can be and now that's my childhood, and then I can go forward. But for me, all of a sudden I had a sister who existed around the time that I was becoming an adult, but I didn't know it. So it shook me up to have to do a revisionist history, speaking of history. I wanted to reveal that kind of, and I guess I would say the film plays around with hindsight a lot, so that the film isn't all knowing. And that was super important to me, that I wanted you as a viewer to understand that I wasn't always the wisdom that comes with hindsight is not just a given. You have to kind of recognize that you are now more aware, and that your hindsight has at different points is influenced by things that were secrets and then that were revealed, and you start to doubt everything.
Yeah, I mean, there was that scene with your sister. Oh, you'll forgive me if I don't get the name right. Is it
Beth?
Beth, yeah, exactly. And that scene is so much, I feel, the moment where you suddenly realize the cost of this, and also the sense that what she says about going around the house and looking for photographs of people That really felt like, someone else was sort of making their own documentary just in their own head here. And
that is so well put. And I don't think I could have thought, yes, that we're all constructing the documentary of our lives that's in our consciousness, that we have to move through the world and we think we know who we are, and then we are, like, she literally didn't know completely who she was. And there's photographs from my other sister whom I didn't know about, Julia, where she's showing these very traditional pictures of her with her mother and with my dad at different ages, and they're set up in the most snapshotty way, but they're in her photo album, not in mine. So, and I think that the compartmentalizing that was part of my story and our story would be really hard now because of cell phones. I think that it's that our lives are much more documented in a more fluid way now, and that probably some of those images would have been shared via social media, for example, or DNA, like a lot of different ways that I would be more aware now than I was in all those decades. Like the science and the technology would make that compartmentalizing of my dad's life really impossible, I think, now.
It does become as well a sort of history of its own recording, because you're using video and you're using the flaws on the video and the strobing of the static that I recognize all too well from terrible video cameras.
I'm so glad you brought that up, John. I'm really, really, really glad that you picked up on the fact that I used the quote progression of the technology. When people talk about the history of film, and they usually say, and then we had the silence, and then hooray, we had the talkie. We had sound came in, but then there's a lot of people who say that ruined the image because you were indebted to the sync experience, and the freedom that came before sync sound was like such an homage to the image. So then we get stuck with sync sound, and everything is so clunky, and and the emphasis is on dialogue and the delivery of and the clean delivery of dialogue and all that kind of stuff. So, but you picked up on the shift from 16 millimeter film to early consumer VHS video to high 8 to Super 8 film, movie film, and back to, like, the only constant is 16 millimeter film. And to me, it's the most beautiful. It ages best. And I used the same camera in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was starting to shoot with my dad, that I use today, which I bought for $400.
Oh, that's value for money.
Yeah. And I bought it used. And it doesn't require a battery. And I've taken it all over the place. I've taken it to Vietnam. I've taken it to Italy. And I'm not dependent on electricity with that camera. And so it's really interesting. Now you shoot with your cell phone, and you shoot with like what's all different formats that we have today. And it's considered more precise or more sharp, but I'm not sure that ultimately I don't think it's better. And that's why I wanted to show the materiality of the film growing up with us and moving through time, not just the subjects. And also, I would say I wanted to play with skin too, because the skin will grow old. There's nothing you can do about that. Like, my dad grows older at exactly the same rate as I do. So we are a constant, but we change. Whereas the medium of expression, visual, does change, but even like the poetry of it or the discourse of it is different according to which machine you use.
How did the rest of the family feel about the film? Have they all had an opportunity to see it? And did you feel any sort of qualms about that? Or
yeah, I was really, really, really nervous. Some of my siblings came to the first screening, which was in Park City, Utah, last year at the Sundance Film Festival. It was the opening night, and then showed a few other nights. And then other siblings, as well as my dad, came here to New York to the Museum of Modern Art, which was in February of last year. And actually, a lot of people told me that was the last time they were in a theater. I guess I'll say it was lucky for me that it's called Documentary Fortnight at the Museum of Modern Art was in February because everything closed down in March. It's beginning to reopen, but people are still hesitant to go to theaters. And then, so not all my siblings came to either of those live events. Then others saw it when I took it to them. And then I'll say one of my siblings hasn't seen it yet. I have given that sibling many opportunities, but they haven't chosen to see it, but hopefully they will. And they've been super supportive, just nervous about how they might look or something like that. But it's been very gratifying. And I think that in general, they all say that making the film and that day that you pointed out when Beth was speaking about her life brought us closer as a family. And we now meet every single Sunday with my dad on Zoom. So we met yesterday. And so that was the first time, but we've kind of continued it, well, because of the pandemic. We weren't doing it in 2018, but so since the film has been finished, we've met almost every week. So it's, the current social situation of our earth has in some ways brought an additional intimacy in a way.
It's strange how we're relating through. I mean, we're doing this interview on Zoom as well, and we've all got used. I mean, Zoom. 3 years ago, I didn't know what if such a thing even existed. The idea of Skyping wasn't particularly, certainly wasn't present in a lot of people's lives. And now we've gone from being maybe a bit overly critical of screens to absolutely, desperately needing them for this kind of thing.
I know. It's why I'm actually about to, every year I organize a lecture at New York University. I used to teach there and I'm not teaching there right now. It's a lecture called The Experimental Lecture. And it's been going on for 11 years. So Jonas Mekas, you probably know his work. He was one of the people who gave a lecture, and Barbara Hammer, a lot of experimental filmmakers. So the lecture itself is very inventive. So this year it's supposed to happen in person. I canceled last year, but nobody who's not part of the community at New York University will be able to come. And since I'm not a part of the community at New York University, I don't even know if I'll be able to be in the room, and I'm the organizer. So I'm thinking, I think this would be better on Zoom, because then we could invite anyone all over the world to come. And it has a bit of a reputation in the experimental community. So it's funny, like I have the sort of a quasi option of doing it live, and I'm thinking Zoom would be better.
In what ways is it an experimental lecture? Is it the actual format of the lecture is shaken up?
Yes, that's the main thing. We don't allow the lecturer to show finished films. They're supposed to talk about failed projects, things that just couldn't get done, or things that are still sitting on the shelf but are haunting you. I want it to be about process and about doubt. These are generally people whose films they're call them veteran artists. Like, do you know Jonas Mekas? Did you ever see his
Yes, yeah.
I mean, he was amazing. We had so many people who came for that lecture that we had to have an additional room, actually, with closed circuit TV.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. It was the closest thing. And when Barbara Hammer, who's like a great hero of mine, gave her lecture, she carried the projector around up and down the aisles of the auditorium and projected on every single wall but the screen. And the talk itself is really inventive. So it comes out of experimental film, but the talk is not your traditional artist talk. So I've been doing it for 11 years.
Well, let's hope. Does that take place?
November 19th.
Okay, so hopefully
I'll try to invite you. It will definitely be on Zoom. The question is the live part of it, but we'll see.
Oh well, I'd love to watch it. Yeah, absolutely. And so, what is your next sort of project now that you've have you found, like, lockdown and everything a moment where you've become productive? Because I've talked to people who've had both reactions. Some people have been really productive. Other people have been like, I can't get anything done.
I guess I'll just answer. I've actually made 5 or 6 films, short films, and I'm working on a longer essay film. So I've had some extremely exhilarating collaborations. I made a film called Girl is Presence with a poet from California. And that film, wow, it's traveled to a lot of places. And it went to Germany, went to Brazil, went to Argentina, a lot of different spots. Epistolary has shown in Russia and in the UK at the Sheffield Film Festival. It showed in Spain. So it's been interesting because I'll do Q&As sometimes through Zoom and often with other people who were in the same program, which I love, and especially if they give us a chance to watch each other's films. And with Film About a Father Who, that film showed in virtual theaters mostly around the US. And now it's I'm supposed to go to I'm planning. I already have the ticket, but I was invited to the Cork Film Festival in Ireland doing. Yeah, they're going to do a artist focus on my films. So they're showing 11 of my films, including Film About a Father Who. And then Film About a Father Who is supposed to show, and it is set to show at the Cinematheque in Paris. So I was invited to go there. So I'm going to be doing quite a bit of traveling in November, which I haven't done any except for family kinds of things in almost 2 years. So it's actually been a kind of a good time to work. I've been, as I mentioned, teaching quite a lot of these workshops on film and poetry. And so that's been wonderful because a lot of my students in those workshops have started collaborating and making films that have even shown in film festivals. So I'm very proud of them.
And coming back to the poetry, the collection that I read, it feels open-ended. It feels like you could easily continue that for a second, third, fourth volume.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I'm still writing poetry. I am actually going to read a poem publicly on Sunday. I'm not writing it exactly that way, but I wrote a long poem, which I called Pandemic Time, that includes a lot of like the scruff and detail of this last few years. Like there's some things I already miss about pandemic. For example, there were about 3 months where we were on lockdown and we were at home all the time. And then at 7 p.m. at night, everyone would go outside and bang pans.
Right.
And it doesn't sound very typical thing for people to do in the United States. It sounds like you would. I know they do that a lot in Argentina, and I love it. Maybe we picked it up from the Argentines. But I thought that was a kind of wonderful and kind of musical interaction. It was supposed to be celebrating the first responders, but it was also very bonding just on the street because it was like this symphony for about 1 minute every day.
I think it might even have started in Italy. I don't want to claim too much for Italy.
I wouldn't say it started here. I think we copied somebody. So probably in Italy. It sounds like, yeah.
Just because we had the worst European outbreak very early on, and I remember what happened. I remember there being some famous film of they would go out on the balcony, as you say, 7 o'clock in these tenement buildings in Napoli and in Rome, and some of them there'd be an opera singer, so there would be they would sing the national anthem, and there was this phrase that you saw flags everywhere of this phrase, tutto andrà bene, everything is going to be all right. And after 6 months, people began to take those signs down because I think it was like, well, maybe not, but we in the end it was okay. I think in the end, I think I'm very, because I'm between England and Italy, so I went back to England once. I haven't been back to England for over a year now, but I was impressed with the way Italy handled it, and less impressed by the way England handled it, I have to say. Well, there's one last question I'd like to ask, which is we always ask everybody on the podcast to give me a film book. Oh,
I prepared.
Ah, right. Yes, okay. Very good.
But this is a podcast, so I have to tell you. Yes. Finish your question.
No, that's it. I want your film book recommendation straight away, please.
Okay. I could say I did my homework, but it was so easy. That it wasn't really homework. So I would say the film book that I go to regularly, I go to as a muse, I go to for guidance, I go to acknowledge that there is this weave between sound and image, and that image should never take precedent over sound, but must be like, it must recognize the subtleties of sound in a way that enhances awareness. And I would say that would be Notes on the Cinematographer by Robert Bresson, because I think it's a wonderful book full of good advice, and a book that can apply to experimental filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, narrative filmmaking. I mean, when I think of Bresson, I do think of narrative filmmaking, but there's such a brilliant awareness of space and light and the qualities and possibilities of silence, and how that pause gives time for reflection and a kind of intense engagement. So I would pick Notes on the Cinematographer.
Brilliant. I've never read that. I'll have to. I've obviously seen Bresson films, but I've never read that book. So, and as a filmmaker, a huge inspiration there.
Yeah, and actually, I was reading the back, which is interesting. There's a quote. Can I just read it out loud?
Sure, go ahead.
By none other than Jean-Luc Godard. He said, Bresson is the French cinema as Dostoevsky is the Russian novel and Mozart is German music. Listen to him. Quote, a good craftsman loves the board he planes, unquote. So it's actually beautiful because it's looking at the craft of filmmaking. And earlier we said that I sort of introduced the idea of, like, I wanted to be a filmmaker more than a director. And I think that Bresson in The Trial of Joan of Arc or Pickpocket or Diary of a Country Priest, he's involved in all aspects of it as a filmmaker, and that like has an attention to those, to like how the tools work for us, and how to respect the tools and how to push the tools to go in directions that reveal new things about cinema.
No, that sounds brilliant. That's definitely.
Look it's such a little book. You can carry it in your backpack or your back pocket. I'm
definitely getting that. That's another copy to go on this podcast is costing me so much money.
Well, according to the back of this book, you could buy this for $8.95. So let's say 10 euros.
Yeah, nothing for that. For the price of wisdom, which is Yeah, absolutely. Listen, Lynne, thank you so much for taking your time to talk with me.
Very nice to meet you.
So I hope you enjoyed our conversation. It was a real pleasure to talk to Lynne about poetry and about filmmaking. Her recommended book was Robert Bresson's Notes on Cinematography, which you should put on your reading list, as I have immediately. All that remains is for me to thank Elliot Atkins for the music and Ali Howard for helping out with the artwork. Until the next episode, please take care.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.